For our second session of day 3 of the Covering Equitable Community Development Fellowship, I'm sure we've all been following the news of the devastating impact of Hurricane Helene and how it caught communities like Asheville, North Carolina, and other remote communities completely off guard. And so now, with the already struggling Florida bracing for Hurricane Milton, this is a good time for us to sort of pivot the conversation about advocating for communities that are hit by natural disasters and what that means. I think in a way that what's happened in Asheville is really going to elevate the issue of climate injustice for communities around the country. And I can think of no better place for us to be exploring that issue than New Orleans. And so we're joined today by Top Bowie. Top is the executive director of Sông Community Development Corporation in New Orleans. She works with a very diverse community across a demographic age range of people who her agency serves. Certainly there is the Asian American perspective that she will be able to share with us deeply. But I think your expertise in building community, finding resources, getting resources to the people who need them when they need them is such a critical part of this discussion of community development. And so I want to start, I know you've prepared a presentation for us, but I wanted to ask you and put that question to you. Do you think that the way Hurricane Helene hit Asheville, a city that most people consider, liberal, affluent, et cetera, and the way it devastated, do you think that there's a window of an opportunity to talk about equitable resources and development in a way that didn't occur when the Ninth Ward was?
Oh yeah, for sure. Good morning, everyone. Hi, again, my name is Top Bowie and I'm co-executive director of Sông Community Development Corporation. And to your question, yes, I think there's a lot of attention right now on Asheville and North Carolina, but also because of where we are in the political climate, that was different from Hurricane Katrina. So I think, yes, there's a lot of attention, and yes, we'll see how resources trickle down that might differ, whether or not they're equitable in terms of like who their constituents are and how they're responding. I think this is an example of where we can really like hone in and use this as a case study.
All right, well, I'm going to step aside and let you take it away.
So again, I'm really happy to be here. Let me stand to the side. It's been a while since I've done this, so please feel free to raise your hand at any point during the presentation to ask questions or clarifying points. But I kind of want to get a lay of the land to see who's in the room. All right, anyone from Seattle? Hey. California, Westminster, Los Angeles, Houston, Texas, Fairfax, Virginia. This is not random, but these are all communities where we know there are a large Vietnamese population. But what's lesser known before Katrina is the Vietnamese American community in New Orleans. So I really want to set the foundation and talk about the history of the Vietnamese community. This is a photo by a local photographer who's documented the Vietnamese refugees since 1975. So it's an elderly couple in their home in 1978. But our story really started, in 1954. We have to talk about the Vietnamese refugee journeys and different migrations. It's just not them leaving Vietnam and then going to a refugee camp. It actually happened within Vietnam. As you know, Vietnam was colonized by Chinese, by the French. But in 1954, North Vietnamese people fled North Vietnam because of fear of persecution for being Catholic in a growing communist regime. So many fled south. From there, the end of the war happened on April 30th, 1975. Note that importance of that date because next year is the 50th commemoration year of the fall of Saigon. So side note, but in a lot of Vietnamese communities, they're prepping for the 50th anniversary, and there's going to be a bunch of like different commemoration events. So from 1975 to 1995, you know what's called the Vietnamese boat people. more than 800,000 fled by sea, and between 200 and 400,000 died or went missing. This could be due to piracy or just being on boats that were not equipped to stay out at sea for very long periods of time. Many went to neighboring countries in Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, but they were also not equipped to take on this massive amount of refugees.
Could you just talk about what was driving them to leave?
They wanted to leave. They didn't want to be a part of the communist government. Because the ideologies didn't align, and a lot of them, were Catholic, and there was a fear of being persecuted by the regime that was going in power. And I don't want to get into the history of the Vietnam War and how really the U.S. perpetuated that, but that's a whole nother conversation. So there's this whole savior mentality that a lot of Vietnamese people have because they feel like they owe the Americans something because it was them who helped them facilitate the leave. But anyway, so a lot resettled in Hong Kong, USA, Switzerland, France, and all around the world. This is Dao, or the island of Pidong in Malaysia. My parents actually ended here in 1981. But as you can see, none of these places were equipped to take on refugees, so they built a lot of the resettlement areas in shambles, and this is essentially how it looked like for many years for Vietnamese refugees. All right, so why did they come to New Orleans, or how? A lot of the Vietnamese refugees ended up in Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. At that point in time, Archbishop Hannon of the Archdiocese of New Orleans went and visited Fort Chaffee and invited families to come to live in New Orleans. 100 families went to New Orleans East, 100 families went to Algiers, and then by 1979, approximately 10,000 Vietnamese refugees settled in New Orleans, and as of now, there are about 30,000 Vietnamese Americans in the greater New Orleans area. We like to say that within the New Orleans East community, we're one of the most concentrated Vietnamese communities outside of Vietnam, just because we're all located in a 2-mile radius. I know California, you have hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese Americans, but I know they're a little bit more scattered. So for us, this is something that we like to say for New Orleans. But I also wanted to show you where we ended. Does this point? So we're in the Village de las neighborhood, which typically on New Orleans maps, it doesn't even appear, right? So there's a little bit on that side that says Village de las in this little square box. And so we're literally at the tip of New Orleans. And this is a zoomed in version of the Village de las. So residents were invited to live at this low-income housing complex called Versailles Arms. So the community also gets this nickname called Versailles. Has nothing to do with being colonized by the French, but it just so happened that's where the community really resettled in 1975. And then the other community that I mentioned that a lot of the families went to will be in the cutoff area of Algiers, which is the only neighborhood to the west bank of the Mississippi River. So in a lot of ways, these communities are physically isolated from the rest of the city. And that community doesn't even show up on the map. All right, so why New Orleans? Archbishop Hannon thought that the tropical climate of New Orleans would be an easy transition for a lot of the Vietnamese refugees, as well as the thriving coastal fishing industry. But there's also deep Catholic influence. So remember that a lot of these Vietnamese refugees came from North Vietnam and were mainly Catholic, went to Fort Chaffee, and they were invited by the Catholic Archdiocese to come to live in New Orleans. They immediately built a church in mobile homes, and then was able to build this little cathedral in 1978, so just 3 years after being resettled in New Orleans. It was really interesting for me to work in this space because about 90% of the community are Roman Catholic. I'm part of the 10% as Buddhist. So stepping into this space was really interesting to see the strength and the power that the Catholic Church has over the community. And then, I don't know where I'm pointing it to. Is it over here? There you go. So this is the the church that was built in 1986 was the Mary Queen of Vietnam church, and that was established in 1983, and it was the first, Vietnamese parish or Vietnamese congregation to be established in the U.S., which is really, really, really cool. What's also really interesting about Vietnamese communities in Louisiana is that they're all centered around the Roman Catholic Church. So you can see the community is built around a church in their community. So I would say in the Greater New Orleans area, there's 4 areas that has Vietnamese concentration, and they're all around the Roman Catholic Church. This is also a photo by Mark Sindler, but this picture was taken in 1976, so just a year after being resettled in the U.S. And there's a teacher talking about Mardi Gras, and it's showing the kids, giving the kids crowns to wear as the king and queens of Mardi Gras. So just thought it was a beautiful way to show the merge of like the different cultures that are being represented here. All right, so it was really important for us to really ground that history of the Vietnamese communities in New Orleans, because you can see that they came there and resettled in 1975, and it was an easy transition for folks. But there was also that strong Catholic influence, and that really played an important role in the redevelopment efforts after Hurricane Katrina. But as you know, Hurricane Katrina happened in August 2005. 16 years later, on the same exact date, Hurricane Ida happened. There's an ongoing joke that we're not afraid of any other date besides August 29th, because that's when storms typically like to form and hit New Orleans. So we hold our breaths whenever August 29th rolls around. At that point in time, Hurricane Katrina was the strongest storm to ever hit Louisiana, and then Hurricane Ida was the second. These are just some images of the flooded areas in the New Orleans East community, Mary Queen of Vietnam Church, as you can see, and then just some of the debris during at the economic corridor of the communities. So when Hurricane Katrina happened, just like everywhere else in the city, no one was prepared, right? City assisted evacuation, there was something in place, but it wasn't really city assisted, right? There was contraflow, there was different areas that you can go to, but no, the city government did not have a plan. So depending on where you were in the community, you got either 4 feet of water or up to 9 feet of water. Residents that stayed went out on their canoes and knocked on every single door in the community to make sure that folks were safely evacuated, or to see if there were any deaths in the community. We were lucky in that there was only 1 death, and she died due to dehydration. She was an elderly woman who was homebound, and there was no one there to care for her. So she unfortunately passed away due to dehydration. And just like everywhere else in the city, folks were yet again being displaced. Sorry, did I see a hand? Or, oh, sorry. Good, okay. Let me go back to this one photo. So Father Vian was the pastor of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church. And one of the things that he did was to go out and find all of the displaced residents to ask if they were going to come back to New Orleans and return and rebuild. I think we made national headlines because we were one of the first communities to come back to rebuild post-Katrina, and that we're very resilient. I have a thing with the term resilient because, yes, we can bounce back from disasters, but it kind of takes away the conversations on like the need to actually get to the root causes of what causes those disasters. So calling a community resilient, like, yes, is great, but let's also talk about like the flip side of that, how resilience can inadvertently cause disinvestments in community, because it's the idea that they can take care of themselves, they'll bounce back, they don't need any support. So what Father Vian did just a few weeks after Katrina was to go out to all the displaced, where all the displaced residents were, and asked if they were going to come back. Most of them said no, like, what are we coming back to? There are no businesses, no homes. No one was sure what was going to happen to the future of New Orleans. The water has receded, but there's still the mold and everything else, and they didn't have the resources to rebuild. But he was like, you know what? I'm going to head back to New Orleans I'm going to clean out the church to the best of my ability, and I'm going to host Mass. So word got out that Father Vian was back hosting Mass at the church, and 200 people showed up. By the following week, 800 people showed up. And by the end of the month, more than 2,000 residents have showed up because they heard that Father Vian was back holding Mass in the building with no electricity, no lights, no water. But that was where the strength of the Catholic Church really comes in, because he's able to galvanize residents and be able to say, like, look, we left to Vietnam, we've built a home here for ourselves, we're not leaving again. So while that was happening, residents were returning in waves, they were working on their homes, they didn't rely on outside assistance. So really, like, in some ways, like an insular community, they supported each other. If one neighbor knew how to do roofing, they traded services for electricity. So, right, there's like a lot of bartering of services. And so the residents were able to recover fairly quickly post-Katrina, only just 3 months after Katrina, versus the Lower Ninth Ward, where we know took a lot longer. So while this is happening, there was a report that was put out by the Urban Land Institute that had recommendations on how to rebuild New Orleans, and they designated the entire New Orleans East as green space. So meaning, let's designate this area to just an open public green space. Let's sacrifice them to storm waters in case that another flood happens. So let's just flood this area. So they'll be like the first zone. Not recognizing that there were communities, especially communities of color, that were already back and rebuilding. On top of that, all this trash that was coming out from gutted homes needed somewhere to go. And Mayor Ray Nagin at that time used his executive powers to designate a landfill that was less than a mile away from the community. This site sat on top of intercoastal waterways. So New Orleans East is made up of a lot of different waterways that all connect to each other. And a lot of our seniors use the waters to irrigate the vegetation that they grow. So obviously there were some health concerns, but they were also told from the beginning from the administration that only construction debris will go in there, but it didn't. It was all the trash from the gutted homes, all of the mold, everything sat on this landfill. And so the community had enough, right? Like, they're back, they're returning. And this is really the first time you saw like cross-racial, intergenerational community organizing in the Vietnamese community. So it's like really progressive for a very conservative community. And they came out in waves. They had young folks talk about like no landfill, how this is going to affect them, how it's affecting all of the different communities in the area. And a few months later, they were able to successfully shut down the landfill. I'm not going to also get into the trash that still sits there and is actually sinking, because New Orleans, based on where we are, subsistence is a big issue, so it's subsiding. All right, and just 5 years later, the BP oil drilling disaster happened. As you all recall, Vietnamese refugees really came to New Orleans because one of the reasons is the thriving coastal communities, and so 1 out of 3 Vietnamese American there are involved in the fishing industry somehow, either through direct shrimping, or tuna line fishing, or working in a seafood processing plant or seafood stores. And so when this happened, as they're also still rebuilding and returning after Katrina, this is another blow to the Vietnamese communities and their socioeconomic impacts. And same thing, right? Like, when this happened, no one really looked to the communities of color. No one really cared enough that, 1 out of 2 fishing vessels in the Gulf area was Southeast Asian. None of the materials that came out to talk about the BP oil drilling disaster was in native languages that they could understand. And so language access was a huge priority for us, especially as we know that the claims process that was going to come out after that is going to heavily impact them. And so how are you going to develop a claims process but not include information on how residents can really fully understand in their own native language? And so we did a huge community organizing effort. This is really when I started work with the organization that was formed after Katrina, MQVN, CDC. Attended a lot of town halls with, as you can see, cross-racial, but also like created our own seafood, Southeast Asian Fishing Association to really advocate for the voices of, all Southeast Asians as this environmental impact was happening. Sorry.
Could you just remind us what year this was?
This is in 2010, May 2010. And so on this gentleman's head, it says "Tôi có cá nên tôi don't die." It's a play off of like Rene Descartes, like I think therefore I am. So it's like I fish therefore I exist. I didn't have the picture of the claims process, but if you look at that photo in the corner, there's a big map with some drawings on it. But essentially, we did a power mapping analysis to show communities like this is the claims process that was developed for you by Obama and Ken Feinberg and everyone involved in BP. Where do you think in this process you have the power or influence? And so folks are like, oh, we're at the bottom. Like, we're just here to get what we're owed. Like we're just, we don't have a voice in this. And so as we're educating them on like where, they couldn't have influence, we're like, you have influence actually where Ken Feinberg is. Like, you have the power to actually select or direct how this claims process should be. This is money that's owed to you. This is not money that you're begging for. And that simple phrase, like switch their light bulb in their heads. It's like, what? You're right. Like, why are we standing around begging for resources when this is money that's really owed to us by BP? So another effort of just like community organizing in light of an environmental injustice. Ooh. Okay, I am not good with clickers. All right, so this is now 2024. There's still some continued challenges in New Orleans. Redevelopment efforts in New Orleans East are still scarce. If you drive, we're 60% of the land mass of New Orleans, 40% of its taxpayer space, but lack of investment have historically been an issue, not just from Katrina, but even from before, just because of the social displacement that folks feel in New Orleans East. Fishing industry is still heavily impacted, not by oil spills, but by imports. And this is not talked about enough. Fisher folks are yet again losing their livelihoods because our policymakers are allowing a lot of imports from Vietnam to come into the communities. And so prices are being undercut right now. Before they were making like $3 or $4 a pound. They're now to like 50 cents a pound. Cost of diesel is extremely high. So like it's not even worth it for them to go out to do a haul or a catch in the shipping season because it's not worth it. They won't make any money from it unless they drive to a different state. Storms, as you can see, are just getting stronger and are forming more rapidly. And then just where we are in New Orleans, we have a failing infrastructure. Sewage and water board, the pumps like barely work, when there's a heavy rainstorm. So it's not just hurricanes that are flooding the city now, it's just one bad rainfall. Electricity grid, it's like owned and controlled by one conglomerate in New Orleans, and that's Entergy. And also, their infrastructure is also failing. So these, on top of like all of the climate and environmental change, really prompted us to start Sông Community Development Corporation in the fall of 2021. So our mission is really rooted in the Vietnamese experience, but we know that in this work, we have to work with all communities, especially communities of color that bear the brunt of all of the climate and environmental injustices. So our work spans environment, health, climate, food, housing, workforce, as well as culture and the arts. All right, I'm gonna pause there for any questions on just some work. Yep. Just you.
Yes, sir. Hi, my name is Kamal. I'm from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I cover racial equity. Before I came to this fellowship, I was also working on a story about the basically the rise and the increase of Asian American and Pacific Islanders within the entire Texas.
Well, please speak a little bit.
Within the entire state of Texas, especially in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And one of the main questions I was asking was called Asian Justice for Texas. It was doing a report, 3-part report on the basic people, the people of Asian American Pacific Islanders, their motivations, and just the demographics. And one of the questions I have for them, and they also were trying to do, was with the political education of Asian American Pacific Islanders, and then get them more involved in terms of voting and get them politically involved. So I was very interested in knowing how has the Vietnamese within like New Orleans, I guess, get their own voices out there politically, and how much do they have I guess, a force within, I guess, the local or state.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's asking about the political willpower of Vietnamese communities, especially in New Orleans. So I'm going to make a statement. Vietnamese, especially those in a generation from like 1975, are going to vote very conservatively because they're going to align their values with the churches. So let's just ground that. Younger people, however, I think are a little bit more progressive, can think outside of what they were taught by parents, right, or the church, and they're able to make their own decision. But I think it's definitely an untapped voice. But use Atlanta as an example. They were a swing state, and I would say it's due to like the Vietnamese, the Asian Americans vote in the last election that really flipped that state. So they have a lot of organizing and advocacy efforts there. A lot of different groups that are voting on that are working on like voter education and rights. In New Orleans, I think it ebbs and flows with an organization that we work with that handles a lot of that work. But I would say like when things like disasters happen, there's a silver lining in that it connects us all, and people can actually like get to the root causes of issues versus like what's being politicalized. Because I think issues nowadays are so polarizing. It is used as a political mechanism that once we're able to step away from that and really talk to like the residents about the real deep issues, then I think they vote accordingly to what is going to benefit the communities. But I would still say, as a whole though, Vietnamese communities across the nation are going to vote conservatively just because they're very patriotic, because they feel that they owe something to the U.S. post-Vietnam War. It gets a little deeper into conversation, but we're just like, based on what we're seeing from like documentaries and hearing from older generations, you can feel that now. Mind you, like again, it was really the Americans that like perpetuated that war and then left them to die, essentially, but they still had this savior complex, whereas like, actually we're gonna come and evacuate you. And so there's this mentality that they're owed something, and so they're very patriotic and conservative at the same time. So, but another silver lining is that generation is kind of dying off, so there's this momentum. I can say that here, it's a relaxed setting, right? Am I being recorded? I'm sorry. But I think there's a rise of young political thinkers. Like even in New Orleans, we have our first Vietnamese American congressman, that was elected, first Vietnamese American council member to the city. So I think my hope is that in the next 50 years that there will be more Vietnamese American politicians.
Hi, my name's Krista Johnson. I'm with the Louisville Courier-Journal, and I'm interested in the long-term impact of relocating Vietnamese people out after Katrina. You talked about the role of the church and how so many families returned right away, but was that the case long-term, or did a significant portion of the community get kind of spread out?
Yeah, so it goes into a different conversation too, but I would say like after Katrina, about 95% of the community returned. But what we're seeing now has been almost, so next year is not just the 50th year of the fall of Saigon, but also the 20th year of Hurricane Katrina. So it's been 20 years since Katrina. What we're also seeing is like a lot of younger folks moving outside of the community, and that's due to like the lack of investments that are in the area, so there are no good jobs. People move away because they feel like New Orleans East is crime-ridden. When people think of New Orleans East, it's like there's a lot of stigmas associated with it in terms of like red light districts, like really violent crimes, and so a lot of the young families have moved out of New Orleans. But I don't think we're unique in terms of like all of the Asian American communities across the nation. We're seeing like just like they're disappearing. You know, a lot of Chinatowns and a lot of historic places, those businesses that anchor the communities also disappearing. And I think this is where we need to have like really critical conversations on how to expand our mind of like what community means. Is just tied to a place or a place of belonging, and then how do we put in critical investments to support like a thriving economy for that area. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Stokes. I work at the NPR station in Atlanta, and not too long ago I read the book The Yellow House, which is a memoir about New Orleans East, and it was my really first experience learning about that part. And a lot of it is reflecting on living in this place that's so outside of the center of tourism that draws so many people to New Orleans. So I'm just curious about that experience in the Vietnamese American community there, how, if there's any like involvement, like if they benefit at all from the tourism to New Orleans.
Yeah, growing up in the community, it definitely felt like a village, you know, because it's like like residents taking care of each other. So yes, I think we've been making more headway in terms of like our impact on the Louisiana landscape since the last 50 years in terms of like food and culture. We have a James Beard Award-winning bakery that's Vietnamese owned, and they make one of the best king cakes. So yes, in terms of like tourism, there will be lines out the door for this bakery. Like people will wait 4 or 5 hours just to get this king cake. But I think there could be more happening, right? Because tourism in New Orleans is just down as a whole. But I also feel a lot of ways tourism can be very extractive, or even with local communities, right? It can feel really extractive. And we need to be able to organize and like really like get people to support, not just like, yes, the food and the culture, but like the people. And so I think that's where we've been trying to forge different partnerships with different organizations throughout New Orleans that are focused on culture and how we can build a cultural district that can really highlight the accomplishments, but also share out the work and really invite people into that space and be a part of it. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
My name is Abdullah Fayyad. I work for Vox. That's Vox with a V because apparently there was some confusion. One thing that struck me was you mentioned that even a heavy rainfall will cause flooding. And I'm curious, I mean, because that seems negligent from the state and federal government if a simple rainfall is causing so much flooding. What efforts right now exist to make it a more climate resilient area to protect people from going through what happened in Katrina and Ida?
Whew, so many thoughts on this. Okay, so let me start off by saying, you know, New Orleans was actually above sea level 300 years ago. It wasn't until 300 years ago people decided to build levees to protect the city that the city began sinking. So, you know, our sewage and water board system, the drainage pumps, everything, to haul and like do an overhaul and rebuild that is going to cost billions of dollars. There's also a lot of like, I don't know, okay, maybe not won't say this just in case I'm recorded, but the people in power are not looking to like really invest in the infrastructure. Like they're fighting amongst themselves most of the time, right? And so this is why elections are important, especially local elections and not just national. But I think on the federal level, there has been a lot of investments in this last administration, especially through the IRA that brought a lot of money to, I think, over the nation around climate and environmental justice, especially the Justice 40 initiative. So we as an organization have been able to tap into that to build more disaster and climate resilience efforts in New Orleans. But also like the city, I know the city of Gretna I was just talking about, got huge grants. Even United Home and Nation, which is a local tribal community that's not federally recognized, recently got $50 million to build out resilience and disaster hubs in the lower bayou areas. So they're an area that gets impacted first whenever a hurricane comes for New Orleans. And so yes, I think we have to step outside of local government to be able to support some of the efforts that are happening, because it's really at the federal level and not really, if I'm going to be honest, at the state or city. But we are working with them on some projects. What we need to do is not just move politicians, but also the people in the office. So what we're finding is that a lot of barriers come from legal teams and like finance teams. You know, as we're like writing out corporate endeavor agreements, these are the people that have the most that we have the most barriers to get through, because the politicians are going to understand the work that you're doing and are going to support it. But when it comes to his team, that's where the work stops. And so with the city, it takes anywhere from like 6 to 8 months to get an agreement in place. And by then, like a different disaster could have happened. So, I mean, that's one of the key takeaways I have for you all. It's just like, you not only need to move the people in power, but you need to move those decision makers that goes down along that chain.
Any other questions? Pass this over to Nick.
Thanks for this presentation. It was great. You spoke about how a lot of resettlement happened in public housing, in a specific sort of public housing development. I've seen and reported on that in other cities, specifically Cincinnati. And similarly, the public housing development was very isolated from the rest of the city. And there were some issues that folks were having as they were resettled in terms of connecting with services, with feeling like they were part of the community. And I wonder what the community feels like in New Orleans, the Vietnamese community, about being resettled there. Was it mostly positive because folks were able to be in close proximity and form community? Yeah. Or was there this struggle with isolation, or was it both?
I would say it was pretty positive in the beginning, you know, just because, again, there's this sense of like freedom and like being able to escape a regime that was going to persecute them. And that most of these residents were from like 3 main fishing villages back in Vietnam. So they already knew each other. So like growing up, that's why I said like it really felt like a village. And the Catholic Archdiocese of New Orleans like really helped facilitate the services, you know, whether it be like language access, childcare, schools, like they really helped them navigate the systems. I think it wasn't until like 40 years later when Katrina happened that they realized, okay, maybe this physical isolation was not in our favor, because now we're being X'd out of a lot of conversations around just reinvesting in New Orleans as a whole. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you near the end? Or
I don't think
because
so.
I have like 5 questions
Okay.
I want to ask you.
Like,
So
I don't know
just
how
wanted to know.
I was just going to talk about one of the environment and climate justice initiatives that we have, I think. So I can share this slide too, but you know, some of the current priorities that we have as an organization is around community development, programs and services, and these are like limited and time bound, and then overall policy and advocacy. But I wanted to talk about one of the program highlights, and it's Waters by You, a play on Bayou. It's a collaborative effort to really design community-based solutions for issues such as flooding and assistance that we constantly see, but also really work with communities to reimagine their relationship with water. Because water up to now has always been seen as a negative thing. But when you travel to other parts of the city, for example, Bayou St. John, they utilize their bayou. They canoe in it, they picnic by it. It's like, we actually have a lot of waterways in New Orleans East. Why can't we have this also as a resource? So switching that mentality that, you know, water is this negative connotation to something more positive. So we're working with residents to build their capacity and understanding of just water quality issues, and then designing green infrastructure. So using nature-based solutions to mitigate some of the hazards such as floodwaters. So I just want to show you some of the things that they were doing, but you know, we hosted several workshops and field trips throughout the community with about 20 to 25 residents. So it's like boating in Bayou Sauvage. Like, we're also right next to the nation's largest national wildlife refuge. So how do we use that as an asset? Abundance in the East. So like reframing like how we traditionally viewed water in the communities, and looking at it in the terms of, you know, something positive, reinforcements. So going out to abundance in the East, like, yes, we have lack of investments in the area. We still have a lot of blighted buildings, but there's also a lot of things here that we should be proud of. So it was a 6-month training program. It was hands-on learning, site visits. Cohort members received up to $250 if they take part in at least 3 of the cohorts. And again, 15 to 20 participants with representation from all ethnic backgrounds, ages, gender, and sexuality. So just wanted to show you some photos. That's Bayou Sauvage. We're looking at like some different native species that are in the area. I'm gonna skip that. It's a more just like reimagining some of the canals and green infrastructure designs, and then Abundance in the East tour. So one of the culminating projects is to develop a 60-foot rain garden trench in the area as a demonstration on how green infrastructure can really actually help support and mitigate some of the flood water damage that we see. And this is a small part of a larger initiative throughout the city that we're seeing that folks are taking on just green infrastructure initiatives. There's another group that works with residents to build out designs within their homes. So individual small scale green infrastructure. We're working with the city of New Orleans. At least this is one of the stronger partnerships that we have to develop a 10-acre parcel in the West Bank around green infrastructure and stormwater management. And so there's a lot of efforts right now through funding that is supporting at least a lot of local initiatives that's led by BIPOC leaders to rebuild a more resilient infrastructure for the city of New Orleans. But there's been asks for us to like replicate this water leaders cohort in the Waters by You program in other parts of the city. So I think that's a successful takeaway that we have for this. But this, I think I have 2 more slides. Are we good on time? Okay. So just like want to wrap up and say like, you know, some of the lessons learned in this work surround like importance of community-driven process. Like again, we just can't talk to residents, right? It really has to come from them on what they want to see change. Because that's only then do they feel empowered to take initiative and to really take cause and address root issues, right? Increase capacity of residents. Like we can't go into these communities and expect them to like know everything about what we're trying to do. We have to like work with them to build their understanding and their capacity to take on these issues. This is the third point is really important to us. Pay them as what you pay consultants or experts. We need to make that a norm, right? Because we get a lot of requests all the time to participate in different sessions or come speak or whatever it is, but we're not giving residents like the time and the money that they're experts of their communities and their lives, and so they should be paid and compensated as such. Emphasizing that personal connection to issues. You know, like I said, we were kind of like a sleeping giant before Katrina, right? But the silver lining of Katrina was being able to have stories of people connecting to a place that they don't want to be displaced anymore and that they want to rebuild. And then the need to move both community and decision makers, especially those in legal and finance. I'm going to underline that a few times just because, you know, again, I think you can get residents and politicians to be on your side for different causes, but when it comes down to like getting the work done, the biggest barriers to making that happen are the people that work within that department. And then some recommendations, as you all, I'm really happy also to see like such a young group of folks in the room, just because like a lot of times when we step into this space, we're talking at, you know, researchers that are investigators and a lot of older people. So it's great to see young minds in the room. But really recommendations are to connect with and amplify voices of minority communities. There are gonna be communities that are left out of these conversations. Like, yes, it might be a little bit harder to find them, but yes, they are there. And really make an effort to like build that trust in the relationship with them, because a lot of times, again, like post-Katrina and post-BP oil spill, we got requests to do articles like 10 times a week. And a lot of times they were not reported back, or we don't know the results of it. Like we're expected to like find it, right? So if you're gonna go out and write stories on minority communities, really make an effort to share back. Like, this is what we've heard. This is the article that was written. Like, what do you think? And especially if you're speaking to like limited English proficient folks, make an effort to translate it. I don't think it's that hard of an ask to be able to translate an article that was written about them into a native language that they can understand. Investigate how public policies are failing minority communities. again, I think we all know this, right? Climate change is real. Subsidies to fossil fuel and the lack of support for renewable energy, that still needs to be uplifted, because at the end of the day, if this doesn't move on the federal level, the storms is just going to hit every single part of the nation. No one is safe anymore, right? This is not just coastal communities. We're seeing it move further inland, and we're seeing stronger and faster forming, storms. And then I think the last part is also really important, because there's a lot of funding out there right now to support communities to do this, and it's to build governance and accountability structures. So I think there's a role that press can play in this part, and it's just like be a champion in governance and hold decision makers accountable. Like as this money is being like funneled down to communities, even like post disasters or like now, while they're building out more resilient communities, we can hone in and look at how decisions are being made and where funds are being allocated. So hold those decision makers accountable, because sometimes these cities sit on millions of dollars and then do nothing with them for years. And this is the example of the city of New Orleans. People hear about, they know about it, right? But their voices are not being heard. So I think there's an opportunity to amplify those voices, because, communities are incredible watchdogs when it comes to federal funds that get trickled down. They know. So they just need to be able to have a platform to like uplift those voices. So there's a big role that I think press can really play on that.
Pass the mic up.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering my questions throughout. My name's Amanda Goki. I'm a reporter. I cover New Hampshire for the Boston Globe. Awesome. I wanted to ask what we as journalists can learn from the work that you have done reaching out and so effectively connecting with these communities. Mm-hmm. Like, what do you recommend that we do as we're trying to build some of these communities and learn from them and do that sort of engagement reporting work?
And outreach. Yeah. Again, like organizations like ours get requests like that all the time, right? But it's like really building an effort to like be a part of the community or like be intertwined in some ways. Show up to community meetings, like that's the simplest thing. Like build trust with organizations, because a lot of times we can tell when things are going to be extractive, right? And so once you build that trust and rapport with organizations that are doing this work, they can like lead you to residents that can help whatever article that you're trying to write. But I think, again, at the end of the day, being mindful that sometimes it's a no, just because we get these requests. We have other also like, priorities that need to be addressed immediately. So maybe it's following along and not trying to take away like time, right? Like maybe following along their journey in terms of like, if they're doing a project meeting or something, go to it instead of like trying to get them to host something for you. So I think there's an opportunity to like work with them and follow along with their schedule versus trying to do something separate and parallel, if that makes sense. Yeah, but I think a lot of organizations have built trust with the communities. The church is always a good start, I say, just because of the stronghold that they have over a lot of Vietnamese communities.
Come up here if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
I have a question that I want to ask, because you want to sit here maybe?
Oh, no, I'm going to stand.
You're going to stand?
I'm gonna
Okay,
take
all right,
the
all
chairs
right, all right, no problem. So I'll sit then. I had a conversation with someone recently who founded a nonprofit out in the Bay Area. She led it for 10 years, but she's just about to quit. The reason she gave was primarily, as a woman of color running a nonprofit, you are essentially Superwoman, Wonder Woman, everything wrapped into one. You're given the expectation to save your community or do whatever it is you're doing, but the infrastructure might not be there, or the connection from the funders to understanding what really needs to be accomplished in the community and how much funding that would require. And then all of the sort of percentages, you can't use this much for whatever. So I want you to talk about the impact of that on you and the work that you do in terms of serving the public, but also dealing with all of these different factors.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give a little bit about my personal history. Well, I'm like, it sounds like all of a sudden. So I started MQVN Community Development Corporation as a community organizer after the BP oil drilling disaster. Worked there for about 5 years. Went on to work at United Way of Southeast Louisiana, and I saw that there was a United Way person here yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah. And then left United Way to go back to the community. So in a lot of ways, United Way like helped framed the injustices in the funding world that I saw and felt, coming from a community organization and then stepping into a funding space. So I was in charge of all of the grant making activities at United Way and foundations as a whole, overhaul because, they're rooted in oppressive systems, right? And so I really left United Way because I'm gonna make a statement. This is true to myself. When I left, I told the executive director that I can no longer be a part of an organization that keeps white people in power. And that's what the funding world is. And so I am extremely unapologetic when it comes to calling out the systemic racism that I see, especially in the foundation world. So I think we have to be loud and aggressive all the time, but also like not be afraid to take up space. So I tell my team this, I tell my co-executive director this, is like, don't be afraid to voice your opinions because what's the worst that can happen? They'll just say no, right? And we can move on and find someone else who's more funding aligned. So a lot of the work that I do with Jen is around like shifting policies around trust-based grant making because we just need more of that. We need more foundations that can actually support the communities that don't make us like jump through hoops just to access $10,000, write 10-page narratives and reports. Like that doesn't make sense, okay? And I saw it from firsthand, like how much time funders actually spend reading it versus the amount of time that we spend writing it. Like there are so many inequities in grant processes that we constantly call out.
Well,
yeah.
One of the points that she made was that, again, a community-based organization competing for a grant with an organization that's been in existence for 50 years, has a huge, relatively bigger staff,
Yes.
And producing a template of expectations and requirements that literally don't take anything, the realities of these organizations into play. Mm-hmm. And so you're almost set up for failure. Yeah. How do you keep your energy and your momentum up when it almost feels like it's...
I mean, like just also like with funding, right? Like it sets up space for competition. Like it doesn't set up space for collaborations within organizations because we're competing for the same scarce resources. And so what we've been able to do as an organization is like collaboration is key. Like we're not applying just for our own program. We're applying to support XYZ organization also in our community. We're writing them into our own grants. Just because we know that we can't move systems unless we move each other, right? We can't move it by ourselves. And so I think that's where a lot of the grant making activities have to go. Easier processes, trust-based philanthropy, but also funding collaborations and not just like single programs because we see that that's not as effective as it could be.
Are there any other questions out here? So when it comes to, the talk about community engagement takes me back 40 years, literally, to the St. Petersburg Times. And I was in the Clearwater Bureau. And I think I was the first black reporter in the Bureau. And when I said, well, why isn't anybody covering what's happening in the North Clearwater, which is the black community? And the response was, well, they don't read the news anyway, or they don't, it's not something that we have considered covering. But I say that to say, I was doing community engagement 40 years ago because what it meant was, I'm not a deeply religious person at all, but I went to the AME church to see who was in charge and the people who went and whatever. I would go to community meetings. I would pop into the barbershop to see, the clientele there. And it really is a matter of, as you say, meeting people where they are and finding out what they need. Mm-hmm. So what other advice would you give to journalists to try to, particularly at the policy level of it, how do we approach policymakers in our local communities and ask them about, what's your take on development?
Yeah. Well, twofold. That's kind of tangent, but I don't know if it's going to answer your question. But one is there's also a lot of ethnic medias that is not tapped into. Like in New Orleans, we have 2 Vietnamese newspaper and Vietnamese radio, right? So it's like these are folks that are covering topics all the time, and I think there's an opportunity to work with them to share out like news or work together collaboratively. So just recently, like we asked one of the magazines to like do exactly that. Like, hey, we have an article that's in English. Can we translate it and put it into the magazine so the rest of the community can read about it? They're like, yes. Another thing is like a lot of organizations need support around press releases, because that's just, communications is not just something that we focus on. Like as an executive director, like that's something that I have to take on. But this is where like press can really work to get like feedback from policymakers, because they want to be part of a press release, right? Unlike some of the work that's being supported. But yeah, on the policy and advocacy side, I don't know. I feel like politicians sometimes tell us you whatever you want to hear. So I think it's more interesting to see what communities are saying and then how politicians align with that. Would be like my take on it.
So to wrap things up here, I want to put a question to you that so many of us journalists struggle with through the years, and that is the issue of advocacy. We're told, and I was certainly classically trained to say, you're not an advocate. You're not supposed to care about these issues. You're supposed to just report on them. You're not supposed to express an opinion. Many journalists don't even vote because they worry about what people will think about their political positions. So what message would you give to these journalists about the need to report on these issues and maybe have a little courage in terms of not so much worried about what people think?
Right.
Obviously not doing anything that's not ethical, but for me it boils down to storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
Would you
it
say?
does, for sure. Again, just be bold and I know that's difficult to say. I'm not in the press world, so I don't know the makings of it, but be bold and be unapologetic. Like I think there are different types of news nowadays that, hey, if that doesn't work for you, go into a different space. Like maybe it just boils down to that. There was a new nonprofit that was created in New Orleans recently called Verity News that really supports the work of nonprofits. So I feel like there are a lot of mediums out there. Like you can create your own space. Like this individual was with the Times Picayune, but it's just like, there's a missing space for nonprofit news and things that we can actually advocate for, and he developed one. So I just feel like there's a lot of different ways that you can be an advocate for social change, even if it's not like within your traditional realms of in the press and the media.
Another powerful conversation about what's possible, about advocating for communities that need the support and taking in so many different threads of concern. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Top Bowie for joining us to talk about Song Development Corporation.